She thought she was just a forgotten waitress, until a single photo in a millionaire's mansion unlocked the truth about her stolen past. What she uncovered didn't just change her life. It exposed a hidden system and gave names back to the lost. This story will break your heart, then rebuild it. So watch until the very end, and if it moves, you don't forget to subscribe. Because stories like this deserve to be heard. Mira Evans tightened her apron, tucked her curls behind her ears, and stepped into the grand estate tucked in the quiet outskirts of New Orleans. She didn't belong in a place like this, where marble floors gleamed and champagne flowed without pause. But her uniform was a mask, and she wore it well. She needed this job to pay rent, to buy her younger brother's insulin, to keep going. Today's gig was a private breakfast for Charles Whitmore, a revered philanthropist and business tycoon. Mira didn't care about names like his. She'd poured coffee for dozens of the rich. They all blurred together after a while, but something felt different the moment she crossed the threshold. The scent of sandalwood and old oak, the distant chime of a wind bell echoes she couldn't place, but stirred something deep. She shook off the feeling, focusing on trays and folded napkins. But fate had already begun to crack open a door long sealed. Today wasn't just another shift. Today Mira would come face to face with a truth that had been hidden behind polished portraits and generations of silence. While swapping out food trays with the housekeeper, Mira took a wrong turn and ended up in a quiet hallway tucked away from the main event. It led to a room she assumed was a study paneled in mahogany, lined with dusty books and heavy with the scent of time. She was about to turn back when her eyes caught a line of old portraits on the mantel above the fireplace. Black and white wedding photos, family reunions, smiling faces in Italy, Paris, Greece. Then she froze. There, framed in gold, was a photograph she had only seen once in her life. A young black girl, maybe 6 years old, wearing a faded blue dress and pigtails, standing in front of a brick church with sunlight on her cheek. It was her. Same chipped tooth, same crooked grin. Mira's hand trembled as she reached toward the frame. This photo had never been online. No social worker had shown it. The only time she saw it was briefly when she was 8, hidden in a drawer her foster grandmother had slammed shut and burned that same night. So why, how, was it hanging here in a stranger's house? "What are you doing in here?" a man's voice cut through the silence behind her. Mira spun around, heart in her throat. It was him, Charles Whitmore, the host, the man whose name was on half the city's hospitals and scholarship programs. Even in his 60s, he held a presence that made you stand straighter. He looked at her, then at the photo, and froze. Walking forward, his gaze didn't leave the frame. "Do you know that girl?" he asked, voice low, almost cautious. Mira swallowed hard. Her palms were damp. I, I think it's me." Charles stiffened like someone had whispered a ghost name. "What's your full name?" "Mira Evans." His breath caught. Something in his expression shifted, not confusion, not disbelief. Grief, recognition. "Evans," he whispered. "That can't be." Mira could barely speak. "I don't understand. That photo, how did you get it?" Charles sat down slowly in the leather armchair behind the desk. "That church, we used to run a summer program there. 20 years ago, for abandoned children. There was a little girl, with your eyes, with your energy." He looked up at Mira. "She called my wife Miss Cloud." They sat in silence for a long moment, the air between them heavy with something neither had words for. Finally, Charles spoke, his voice shaking slightly. "My wife and I, we tried to adopt, years ago. There was a little girl who stayed with us for a short time, just a few weeks. She was brilliant, curious. She drew rainbows and danced when she thought no one was watching." He smiled faintly, eyes distant. "We tried to adopt her, but the paperwork disappeared. We were told she had been moved to another state. Her file was sealed. We never saw her again." Mira stared at him, stunned. You remember all of that?" Charles reached into the drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a pair of tiny gold earrings, a faded drawing of a rainbow, and a letter sealed with red wax. "We kept this for her. For you." Mira's hands trembled as she held the drawing. Her name was scrawled in crayon at the bottom. "I've worked 2 jobs," she whispered, tears threatening to fall. "I lived my whole life thinking no one cared, that no one ever looked for us." Charles shook his head. "You have no idea how wrong that is." The dinner bell rang somewhere deep in the mansion, but Mira didn't move. She couldn't. Everything she believed about her childhood was unraveling at her feet, silent and unstoppable. Charles stood, eyes still on her. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as staff, as family. There's a room upstairs with your name on it. I want to know who you are." Mira blinked through the fog in her chest. "This is too much. I need time." Of course he nodded gently. "But know this, Mira, you were never forgotten. You were never alone." That night, Mira sat in her car outside the estate, the letter still clutched in her lap. She finally broke the seal. "My dearest Mira, if you're reading this, it means you found your way back. We never stopped loving you. The world may have taken you from us, but it couldn't erase your light." Tears fell freely. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible. She wasn't just a waitress or a case file. She was seen. She was remembered. And something inside her, something shattered for years, finally began to heal. That night, Mira didn't drive home. She parked outside an old library and sat there in silence, the letter pressed against her chest like a heartbeat. Her mind couldn't settle. Every word from Charles, every image in the wooden box, they swirled in her thoughts like leaves in a storm. Her name, Mira Evans. She had worn it like armor, like camouflage, like proof she was still here despite it all. But now that name felt like a borrowed coat from someone else's closet. Who had given it to her? Who took away the one she was born with? She read the letter again under the flickering dome light. "You are our daughter in every way that matters. If we couldn't raise you, we could still remember you. We never stopped." For a child who grew up being passed around, silenced, mislabeled, this letter was a revolution. A rebellion against everything she was told to forget. Mira wiped her tears, then looked up at the night sky. Some truths are buried. Others wait patiently tucked inside forgotten drawers and sealed letters until your heart is strong enough to hold them. Tonight she had begun to remember. The next morning, Mira showed up to her usual diner shift like always, but her hands trembled as she poured coffee. Her mind wandered with every clink of a spoon. Marcus, the head cook and a father figure in her life, noticed immediately. He pulled her aside behind the kitchen where the hum of fryers softened the world's noise. "What happened, kid?" he asked gently. She told him everything about Charles, the photo, the letter, the house. Marcus didn't interrupt. He just listened, his face unreadable. When she finished, he leaned against the counter and said quietly, "The world divides people into two kinds, those who leave and those who try to stay." "But he's not my real grandfather," Mira whispered. Marcus gave her a long look. "You think blood makes someone, real love does. Memory does. He kept your picture when the world forgot your name. That's real." Mira looked down, ashamed. "I've spent my life believing no one cared." He placed a hand on her shoulder. He did, and so did others. Some people don't shout their love. They archive it, in boxes, in letters, in silence. Sometimes the loudest kind of love is the kind that waits. 3 days later, Charles called Mira. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice careful. "Something I've kept quiet about. Until now." They met near the old church where the photo had been taken. The building was run down, its bricks cracked with time, but the wind chimes still danced in the breeze, just like in her memory. "I have a brother," Charles began. "His name is Donovan. Back when my wife and I were applying to adopt you, Donovan was managing the foundation's financial affairs. I trusted him." Mira's breath hitched. Charles continued. "When you disappeared, I asked questions. But records were sealed, files erased. It didn't make sense. Over time, I started digging quietly." He handed her an envelope with photocopied documents inside. Mira opened it slowly. Her name, Mira Addison, was there, but crossed out and replaced with a coded ID number. Her stomach turned. "They buried you," she said, voice low. "Like I was a mistake." Charles looked at her, eyes dark with grief. "No, you were a miracle, and someone profited from turning you into a ghost." And with that, Mira understood this wasn't just about family. It was about theft, of identity, of innocence, of everything. The next morning, Charles took Mira to a locked basement room beneath the estate, his personal archive. It was dusty, untouched for years. Only two people ever had keys, Charles and Donovan. Inside were dozens of bankers' boxes, stacked on shelves labeled with dates and initials. Charles found the one from the year Mira disappeared. Mira sat on the floor surrounded by documents, adoption records, transfer papers, internal memos, all carefully typed, all signed, except her file. Her form had been handwritten. Names smudged, witnesses missing, her exit marked as relocated, untraceable. "This is how they erased me," Mira murmured. "They turned me into a filing error." Charles kneeled beside her. "You were never an error. You were a little girl who deserved to be remembered." Among the documents, Mira found a folded photo of herself as a child, not the one from the church, but one she'd never seen. She was sleeping on a couch, cradling a stuffed bear. She gasped, "How did they get this?" Charles said nothing. He didn't have to. The photo wasn't just a relic. It was evidence. Proof that someone had kept her, then let her vanish. That night, Mira sat alone in her apartment, the city buzzing quietly outside her window. She placed the folded letter from Charles's wife on the table, along with the tiny gold earrings she once wore as a child. She lit a candle. Then, with shaking hands, she opened the final letter, the one sealed with red wax. "My darling girl, if you're reading this, it means you've made it back through the storm. You were never forgotten. You were our forever child, even if not in name. The world lost you, but we never let go. Not in our hearts." Tears spilled silently as Mira read the final lines. "Even if I couldn't hold you again, I prayed you'd grow into the woman I saw in you. Brave, fierce, full of light. If no one else tells you, I am proud of you. I always was." Mira clutched the letter to her chest. It wasn't just ink and paper. It was a tether, a thread from the past that wrapped around her heart and stitched a part of her back together. Some mothers rock their babies to sleep. Others leave words behind and trust the child to one day read them and rise. 3 days later, Mira and Charles attended a charity gala hosted by Langston and Company, an elite firm that had long funded adoption programs. Donovan Whitmore was one of the keynote speakers. Mira had never seen him in person. He didn't look like a villain. In fact, he was charming, polished, silver hair, navy suit, and a voice that could lull snakes into sleep. But the moment their eyes met, something shifted. It was just a flicker, a twitch of his jaw, a subtle narrowing of his gaze, but Mira saw it. Recognition. He knew her. She stayed calm, offered a polite nod like any server would. But inside, she felt it, the burn of truth inching toward light. Later that night, a folded note was left on her locker. "Meet me behind the greenhouse. No witnesses." Charles begged her not to go. But Mira needed to look this man in the eyes. She needed to see what kind of person could disappear a child and sleep through the decades. She wasn't going to find closure. She was going to demand it. The greenhouse was quiet, dimly lit by moonlight, seeping through old glass panels. Mira waited with her arms crossed, heart pounding like a drumbeat she couldn't silence. Donovan arrived alone. No suit, no performance, just a man aged by secrets. "You remember me," she said before he could speak. He nodded. "Of course I do." Mira's throat tightened. Why? Donovan looked at the ground. "Because you were never supposed to matter. You were just one more number, a kid lost in the shuffle. And you made me vanish," she snapped. "You sold my chance at a life and pocketed the change." He didn't deny it. "I didn't think anyone would come looking," he murmured. "Least of all you." Mira stepped closer. "You could have apologized. Instead, you watched me suffer and said nothing." Donovan's voice cracked. "I don't deserve forgiveness." "You won't get it," she whispered. "But you'll face the truth, and so will the world." Then she walked away, not because she was done, but because he didn't deserve to watch her become everything he tried to erase. The next morning, Mira returned to the old church where her photo had once been taken. She sat in the last wooden pew, staring at the dust-speckled sunlight filtering through stained glass. She didn't cry. She breathed. And in the quiet, she imagined all the other children like her, names crossed out, files, sealed stories, buried under bureaucracy and greed. She pulled out the list Charles had helped her recover. Names, numbers, disappearances, 27 children. She whispered each name aloud like a prayer. Ethan, Rosalind, Caleb, Nia, Harper. She wasn't just reclaiming herself anymore. She was becoming a voice for the erased. When she left the church, she went straight to the city office and filed paperwork to open a nonprofit. The Remembered House. Its mission: find the missing, reunite the displaced, give names back to children turned into data. She didn't have millions, but she had truth. She had rage. She had love written in the margins of old letters. And sometimes that's all it takes to move mountains. 1 month later, Mira took the stage at the official launch of the Remembered House. She wore a simple white blouse and a necklace Charles's wife had once worn, a token of a love Mira never got to receive but finally could believe in. The room fell silent as she stepped to the microphone. I was a file number, a girl who got lost in paperwork. I grew up thinking no one would ever come for me, that I didn't matter. She paused, steadying her breath. But someone did remember, someone loved me in silence. And when I saw my face on that wall framed like a secret, I realized that even forgotten children leave footprints. She held up a framed copy of her church photo. This girl deserved better. So did every child whose name was crossed out and replaced with a code. She turned toward the audience, adoptive parents, social workers, lawmakers. This isn't about blame, it's about repair. It's about bringing children out of hiding. As the crowd rose in applause, Mira looked at Charles in the front row, tears in his eyes. They hadn't just built a foundation, they had reignited a history. Later that week, a young journalist approached Mira with a brown envelope in hand. I think you need to see this, she said softly. Inside were records, horrifying, meticulous, real. 7 other children had been relocated under Donovan's supervision during the same time Mira vanished. All their names, all their files, all with matching alterations. Mira stared at the names, some she remembered from the group home, others she didn't. She swallowed hard. How many more are there, she asked. We don't know. The journalist whispered, but you opened the door. Mira clutched the envelope, her hands trembling not from fear but from resolve. She wasn't the only one who'd been buried. And now she had a choice. She could stop here, or she could keep the door open for every child still lost in the dark, waiting to hear their names spoken with love. She turned to Charles. Let's find them. He nodded. All of them. Because justice wasn't a destination, it was a road. And Mira was ready to walk it no longer as a forgotten girl, but as the woman who made sure no child would be erased again. Mira stood in the basement of Charles's estate again, this time with a city investigator, a social worker, and the journalist who had brought her the files. Dust hung in the air like time refusing to settle. The boxes hadn't been touched in years. Each folder they opened held names altered, forms, ghost signatures, children erased by a system that had been quietly monetized. Mira's hands trembled as she picked up a file marked E. Ward, status rehomed. This child was never adopted, the social worker said, voice brittle with disbelief. There's no record of him in the National Registry after this. They kept digging. They found payment receipts from shell charities, contracts forged under fake staff names, and memos showing how reduced caseloads meant bigger bonuses. Mira couldn't speak. This wasn't a mistake. It was a machine, and it had names. She turned to the journalist. I need you to publish this, all of it. Truth doesn't fix what's broken, but it burns through silence. And silence had kept too many children in the dark for too long. Today, Mira had lit a fire. The article went viral within 48 hours. The lost files of Donovan Whitmore, screenshots of the altered documents, names of 7 children with missing fates, quotes from Mira, her face once hidden behind aprons and trays now shown on screens across the country. She wasn't chasing fame, she was chasing names. Donovan's attorney issued a cold statement. These are outdated records and misinterpretations of a complicated system. But the public wasn't convinced. Parents began to come forward. One woman said she'd applied to adopt a child in 2007, then was told the child had disappeared. Another described how her niece vanished in foster care and was declared untraceable. Whispers grew into testimonies. Testimonies became patterns. Patterns became proof. The state launched an official investigation into the Whitmore Foundation and several affiliated agencies. Mira watched from her apartment, the candle from her mother's letter still burning low on the shelf. She hadn't just knocked on a door. She had broken it open, and now the light was pouring in. One by one, the names turned into stories. Ethan Ward was found living under a different name in northern Michigan, having been shuffled through 6 homes before aging out of the system. When he saw his childhood photo on the news, he contacted the remembered house. I didn't think anyone was looking, he said through tears. Rosalind Pierce, now a young woman, came forward from Florida. She had long suspected she was adopted under false pretenses. I remember the day I was taken, she said. I wasn't abandoned. I was removed. Each story cut deeper, but also stitched something together. Mira met them one by one, not as a savior, but as someone who had once felt as just as invisible. They cried, they shared photos, they told her things they had never said aloud. I thought it was my fault. I thought I didn't matter. I thought I was broken. Mira held their hands and replied the same way every time. You were never broken. You were stolen, and we're bringing you back. It wasn't just justice, it was restoration. Donovan Whitmore's trial was approaching. Charges of fraud, obstruction, and child welfare violations were stacked high. The evidence was undeniable. But Mira couldn't sleep. That night, she walked alone to the old church, her church, the one where the photo had been taken. The bricks were still weather-worn. The wind chimes still danced like memory. She sat on the same stone steps where she had once eaten crackers as a child. This time, she wasn't lost. She was full of names, full of stories, full of weight, and full of power. She pulled out a notebook and wrote a letter not to Donovan, but to herself. You survived. You found your voice. You didn't burn down the system. You exposed it piece by piece and let truth do what fire could not cleanse without erasing. The stars above her flickered like candles. She closed the notebook and whispered, I'm not scared of the verdict, because I already got mine. She stood and walked into mourning like someone who had already won. The verdict came. Guilty on all counts. Donovan was sentenced to 30 years without parole. As the judge read the decision, cameras turned to Mira. She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She just closed her eyes and whispered, for every child who thought no one would fight for them. Later that day, Mira returned to the remembered house. A small ceremony had been arranged, a private moment just for her. Charles stood beside her, holding a new certificate. Today, he said softly, we restore what was stolen. He handed her a new birth record. Name Mira Addison Whitmore Evans, date of birth, November 3rd, 1997. Status, recognized, remembered, loved. She held the paper like something holy. No more codes, no more folders, no more vanishing points. Her name was hers again, and with it the story of a girl who was meant to disappear, but became the woman who refused to let anyone else be forgotten. A week after the verdict, Mira found herself in her childhood bedroom, what remained of it. The foster home she last remembered had long been sold, but the social worker had saved a single box from the attic. In it were faded coloring books, a broken hairbrush, and a letter. Unsent, written in a child's shaky handwriting. Dear Mommy, are you coming to get me soon? I don't remember your face, but I think you smiled. I think I was happy once. Everyone says I should stop asking, but I won't. Mira sat on the floor, letter in her lap, hands trembling. It was her writing, her hope, her ache captured in ink before she even understood abandonment. She pressed the letter to her heart and cried not just for herself, but for the little girl who had written it and waited. No child should have to beg the world to remember them, and no mother should have her love buried beneath red tape and lies. That night, Mira framed the letter and placed it beside her mother's sealed envelope. The child who waited was finally heard. In the months that followed, letters poured into the remembered house, from foster kids, from adoptive parents, from strangers who saw themselves in Mira's story. But one letter stopped her breath. Dear Mira, my name is Sarah Addison. I'm your aunt. I've been looking for you for 20 years. Mira stared at the name. Addison, her mother's last name. Her name. The letter went on to describe a sister, Elise Addison, who had fought for custody before she died, who had spoken of a daughter named Mira, who never stopped searching until illness took her. Mira met Sarah 2 weeks later in a quiet cafe near Baton Rouge. The moment they embraced, something inside her settled like a door finally closing gently instead of slamming shut. You have her eyes, Sarah whispered, brushing Mira's cheek. But you have your own fire. Mira laughed through tears. I've spent so long building myself from pieces. I never thought I'd find someone who knew where the pieces came from. Family doesn't always arrive early. Sometimes they arrive exactly when your heart is ready. In the main hallway of the remembered house, Mira had a vision, a wall of names, not names on plaques, names restored. She called it the Wall of Return. Each tile bore the name of a child once lost in the system. Below the name was the year they were found, reunited, or finally recognized. The wall began with hers. Mira Addison Whitmore Evans, reclaimed 2025. As weeks passed, more tiles joined hers. Ethan Ward, reunited 2025. Rosalind Pierce, verified 25. Jalen Knox, Remembered 25 families traveled across the country just to touch the tiles. Some left flowers, some left letters. One boy no older than 10 stared at his own tile with wide eyes. "Is this really my name?" he asked. Mira knelt beside him. "Yes, it always was. You just needed someone to give it back." He threw his arms around her. In that moment, Mira knew the truth. She hadn't just survived injustice. She had rewritten the story for everyone who came after her. Sarah brought Mira something unexpected. A worn, leather-bound journal. Her mother's. Inside were pages of poems, advocacy notes, letters she never got to send, drawings, dreams, names of adoption agencies she believed were laundering children for profit. "I think she knew," Sarah said softly, "and I think she died because she was getting too close." Mira turned the pages slowly, reverently. Her mother hadn't just loved her. She had fought, investigated, protected. Even when the world erased Mira, her mother never stopped trying to write her back into it. On the last page in faded ink were 7 words, "My daughter is not forgotten. Ever." Mira traced them with her fingertips. She knew what she had to do. The remembered house would publish the journal, not as evidence, but as legacy. Helena Addison would no longer be just a woman who lost a child. She would be known as the mother who tried to save them all, and whose daughter finished what she started. 1 year later, Mira stood on a stage beneath a sky full of lanterns. She was no longer just the woman who told her story. She was the reason others had the courage to tell theirs. Hundreds of children once lost in the system sat with their families in the crowd. A choir of returned names, a sea of reclaimed voices. Behind Mira was a screen showing their before and after photos. Beneath it, the words, "We were never gone. We were just waiting to be found." She stepped to the microphone. "I once thought survival was enough," she began, voice steady, strong. "But now I know survival is just the beginning. The true victory is rising louder, brighter, bolder, so others know they can rise too." She looked up at the lanterns floating into the dark, each one carrying a name, a memory, a prayer. Not all stories end with rescue, but this one did, because one girl saw her photo on a stranger's wall and lit a fire that never went out. Not for herself, but for every forgotten child still waiting to be seen. Sometimes the world tries to erase people, turning children into numbers files and forgotten names. But no matter how lost you feel, your story still matters. Mira's journey reminds us that even if no one comes looking, even if your truth is buried beneath years of silence, it can still rise. You are not the labels others give you. You are not the mistakes of a system. You are who you choose to become when you reclaim your voice, your name, and your light. And when one person dares to speak up, not just for themselves, but for those still waiting in the dark, entire generations can begin to heal. Because justice isn't just about punishment. It's about restoring what was taken. And love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits quietly for the day you're strong enough to come home.